Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Adventures of Sharkboy and Lavagirl in 3D. I can't even say the name without laughing. From 2005. I where do I start with this one? Okay, background. Someone recently made a reference to this movie to me, and it got me thinking about it because I remember this movie when it was coming out. And it reminded me of some history before it. This is not the first movie sort of in this vein. In fact, it's like a much later entry in sort of a not, well, okay. Before Sharkboy and Lavagirl, there was Spy Kids. Spy Kids, same director, same like kind of core concept. I'll get into that in a minute. But some years earlier. Also directed by Robert Rodriguez, etc. When I was quite young, those movies were coming out, the Spy Kids movies. And I saw at least one of them in theater, possibly more than one, and remember liking them quite a lot. But that was a very long time ago. And I have very little memory of those movies. They are, to some extent, cult classics as they're known now. And I am going to have to go back and rewatch them at some point because they are iconic in certain ways and have some bizarre castings and wild writing. And I am very curious, especially after having watched this, whether they hold up at all or if there are only some like little bits and pieces that are good. This movie came out after the third Spy Kids movie, I believe. And at that point, I had sort of aged out of the target demographics for these types of movies. And in a way, this feels like this movie, The Adventures of Sharkboy and Lavagirl in 3D, feels like the last hurrah of a really weird era. And I'm going to get into that more in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned, I think I already said it, but this is directed by Robert Rodriguez, who I've talked about previously in reference to directing El Mariachi and also his regular collaborations with Quentin Tarantino and generally being a very good director. So why the Spy Kids series and this movie are in his like wheelhouse is very kind of strange to begin with. It's not like completely unreasonable. He's a guy who makes movies, but they are so like the idea that the guy who makes Grindhouse also makes like CG movies for kids is just ultimately very strange. No question about that. Part of my understanding is part of the reason he probably made both the Spy Kids films and this film are because he had young children at the time and wanted some things to both work on with them and for them to watch. I'm not digging deep into the lore about that, but it is just kind of amusing. As mentioned, so I've never seen this movie before. I've seen, I believe, all three of the Spy Kids movies to my memory, and my memory is very hazy on them. My memory was that they were pretty okay, but definitely didn't age well, especially in the realm of their CGI, because they were relatively inexpensive movies with a lot of CGI in a time when CGI was not very good. Like, this is just past the turn of the millennium. CG, especially budget CG, does not look very good in a lot of facets. Even, the Star Warses that were coming out in those couple of years, which I think was like 99 to 2005, 1 to 3. I think that's correct. They don't age as well as you think. They age better than this, no question about that. But like as far as being Industrial Light and Magic being one of the all-time great CGI studios, having comparing the two is night and day. At the same time, you also have other productions like other companies like Pixar who are doing truly incredible work with their CGI at the time, really cutting edge stuff. And while I wouldn't expect this to be Pixar level at any point, it is wild how bad some of this looks. The kind of stuff that if you turned it in as a student project 10 years ago, you'd be told to go back and make more of an effort to render it yourself on your, personal computer. Admittedly, it's hard to, the scale of what the technologies available and the power needed to do the things that are done in CGI is like night and day, year over year. So it's hard to, like, especially if you weren't there at the time or don't have a really good idea of what things were and weren't available, it's hard to judge it completely accurately. And even in my, memory, I can't say for sure that this is completely unreasonable. But there is a part of me that looks at this and goes, some of this is so bad it has to be on purpose. And I say that in no small part because this movie cost $50 million to make. And everything looks bad. Like, okay, let me just come out and say it. This movie is basically top to bottom terrible. And that doesn't really surprise me. I wasn't expecting to go into this and have a great cinematic experience or anything, but it's the level of poor experience going on here is otherworldly. Everything about this is terrible. The CGI obviously comes first and foremost. Everything looks like it looks like Reboot. And I know some people love Reboot, but Reboot was, what year did Reboot start? Reboot 10 years earlier? More? When did Reboot start airing? 94. Yeah. And it was, a very budget TV show being made in Canada. Reboot has more visual charm than this does. And the difference in CGI accessibility and technology between 1994 and 2005 was night and day. So, okay, the CGI looks terrible. It's like all these low poly, like very smooth, either very smooth or very jagged shapes with poor quality textures and just embarrassingly bad animations being done on them. And admittedly, there is a lot of it, but holy cow, I don't know if they just got in too deep or what happened. Now I'm having to go off of my memory of Spy Kids, but part of the problem is almost all of this movie is CGI. Like, I really mean that. There's like 2 or 3 interior locations on extremely budget sets that might, in some cases, might not even have been sets. And everything else is like 100% green screen. Almost everything all of the actors interact with is CG. It's just, if you separate your mind from what's actually going on screen and think about what this looked like for the actors for a minute, it's just, it's It's a couple of kids in really, really bad quality costumes, running around in a green screen room with almost no props at all. So, like, I don't know how they got to where they got with this. Rodriguez is not a poor writer or a poor director. And so where everything falls apart confuses me. And makes me think that trying to be generous, that the only way I can conceive of this making sense is if it was on purpose. Oh, I forgot the point I was trying to make, which was that comparatively, Spy Kids has a lot of CG as well, but my recollection is a lot of it is actual set work, actual props and things. So it's a bit more of a mix. And while that CG may age really poorly, interacting with real things is probably not only looks better, but is also probably a lot easier on the actors. So why they decided to do this, I'm very curious. Something tells me this probably got a lot of external funding as a proof of technology and proof of concept. And now we need to talk about what 3D was like in 2005, because this was a bit of a fad starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, and kind of ending here, of releasing a lot of movies, especially for kids, in anaglyph 3D, the old red and blue lens 3D movies. This was not a new technology. It's been around for, I think it's literally been around for hundreds of years. But it had sort of a weird resurgence in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think they wanted to prove, I don't know if they wanted to prove that 3D was viable, because this wasn't the first movie. In fact, I think in particular the third Spy Kids movie, and possibly some of the ones before it, also used the same thing. And there were a bunch of other movies that came out during that time that also used it. This also would end up leading into later in the decade a lot of I'm forgetting the terminology, but the other type of 3D, which is, rather than using the red and blue tinting with the offset, it used a set of, there's actually multiple kinds, but basically didn't use the red and blue tinting. It was a better technology. I think the only movie I ever watched it with it was Avatar, and it gave me a horrible headache. Yeah, that was a thing that would end up sort of transforming that sort of technological interest over the course of the 2000s from this old school red and blue technology into something that was a different kind, still a gimmick, but a different kind of gimmick, and arguably a better one. It was a more accurate 3D experience. So that makes me think that this may have been, because of the fact that this is almost entirely CG, and it very heavily uses that CG in very overt 3D ways of just like, haha, look at the thing that's coming towards you on the screen, which is basically all 3D was ever particularly good for. If we're honest, it's very rarely implemented well. I haven't watched anything super recently with it. Anyway, this was very much a hallmark of these 3D movies in the 90s and 2000s, is scenes and frames that basically only exist or are shot very strangely in order to showcase the fact that the CG is present and that it works. Now, in the advertisements, this was always like the advertisements for 3D were always shown in this sort of reverse shot of like, you see something come towards the screen and then you see a reaction shot of all these, actors in the ad going, whoa, like they're really just surprised by it. My recollection is that they would also upsell these tickets by like $1 or $2, which at the time, because at the time, old person talking here, at the time, tickets especially for kids were like under $5. And so if you tacked on an extra $1 or $2 for, and all you had to give them was all you had to give them was a set of cheap disposable glasses, because that's how you didn't need a special projector for this 3D for this type of 3D as far as I understand it, whereas you do for the later stuff like the Avatar stuff. That was a huge sell. That's a huge amount of money to make off of not a lot of effort or cost on the part of the theaters. So this gets into my like pseudo conspiracy theory of, does this only exist because there's a huge payback from the theater systems to the filmmakers, the film companies, to fund things to basically cash in on free money? That's my theory, because I can't figure out how else this movie makes sense, or how else it costs $50 million and allegedly has like 11 CGI companies. Yeah, that's what the wiki says. 11 CGI companies, including Industrial Light and Magic, worked on this. Who knows where all of that effort went, frankly. There's so much going on screen, and none of it looks good. That doesn't even get into like everything else about this movie that is bad, which is I'm just going to rattle off the entire list and just slightly tear into certain things, not fully, because frankly, I don't even think that's fair. It's not very sporting of me to destroy this movie. But I'll get into like my expectations for a kid's movie after this. So like, as far as any sort of setting, visual style, anything like that, it's very confusing. It's very nothing, and at the same time everything. It's throwing everything at the wall and just rolling with it. Any idea is said yes to. Visually, there's almost nothing to talk about other than the fact that like everything looks like a mess. And the costumes are atrocious, and the character designs are atrocious, and it all looks extremely budget. And I would actually not have thought this cost more than a few $1 million at best to make, but apparently it was $50 million. The casting is wild, because there are some people of not unnotable names in this list. George Lopez was a very big name at the time, bigger than he is now. Now he's kind of an old man, but it was a big name for like a comedian, and at the time. David Arquette. Was there something else we watched with David Arquette? I don't think David Arquette's a particularly good actor. He's kind of fine. But he was like a B-lister, I want to say, at this time. And probably, this was a really easy payday. I believe, is it Kristen Davis? Apparently she was a big name on Sex and the City. I never watched it, so I don't know, but apparently I think she was one of the major characters on that show. So not an unnotable actor. And then, of all things, we have Taylor Lautner. I think this might be his first film appearance, which is especially I mean, it's funny to me for a whole bunch of reasons, part of which is I don't think he's a very good actor either. And frankly, between in the time between this movie and Twilight, he didn't get much better. But part of Taylor Lautner's whole thing is he wasn't an actor first. He was a martial arts kid. And weirdly, this movie puts his martial arts skills to surprisingly good use. He actually has like choreographed fight scenes that aren't cut all to pieces. He's like, it's all CG. So they're just, making the CG fit to him, but he's actually like there flipping around and, spinning a thing and, doing kicks and punches and stuff. He's actually doing this stuff. So weirdly, that's the most impressive thing, despite the fact that he might be the worst actor on the cast, and the competition is stiff. And then there's a minor character played by Sasha Petersi. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I think she's South African. And so it might be like Dutch or something. And she's had a relatively successful career after this, but like, okay, anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. My point is there's a bunch of B-listers who are absolutely phoning this shit in. And then there's a bunch of kids, all of whom are putting on pretty bad to really atrocious performances. Our main character is played by Caden Boyd, who has like only one other credit to his name ever. Absolutely no direction going on there. Like I said, all the kid actors are atrocious, and as I've mentioned before, I generally don't think kid actors are very good. I always point them out when they are good, because that's usually kind of a surprise. So this is sort of just like what I expect. I expect them to be bad. I expect them to have no sense of what's going on or how to use their voice and their acting and so on and so forth to project the idea of the thing around them. And especially when all of them are like, this is the worst situation, because all of them are just standing around in a green screen room where not only do they not have the best sense, because they're kids, of what's going on in a scene or whatever, they literally don't know, because there's nothing there. It's just a room full of green. So they have no concept of it. And I don't know how they thought that was going to go well. I guess this isn't the first movie like this. And they were just like, well, we made Spy Kids work, and those things turned out cash money, but this one's wild. So okay, I went off on the casting. The casting and the acting, like, it's all phoned in. The writing is also like just atrocious. It's both the dialogue both does not sound like adults and does not sound like kids. It's very stilted in a way that does not make sense to me. It genuinely sounds like a kid wrote it. Not like a kid is speaking it, like a kid wrote it. And honestly, if Robert Rodriguez came out and said, oh yeah, this is basically me just transcribing the ramblings of my children, I'd be like, yeah, that checks out. That actually kind of makes sense, because it's so bizarre in so many things. And the plotting and pacing is like non-existent. Every scene only exists in a vacuum, basically. There's very few callbacks to anything. Any scene that exists has a beginning, middle, and end that runs the course of 3 minutes, in which case the stakes basically don't change. And any actual like narrative arc is basically non-existent, other than, well, I'll talk about the themes a little bit later, because it's got something going on. I'm not going to totally tear it down for that. Likewise with all the visuals, the music and the sound and the editing and everything is just like just a mess. It's just it's not good. It's not the worst. Like, it's not visually offensive to the eyes, but it's not good. And the worst part really is it's not even funny. It's not even like so bad it's good. It's not even I want to get drunk and watch this. I was actually having a beverage while I was watching part of this. And it did not help anything. Not that it was a very strong drink, but anyway, it didn't help, and I wouldn't recommend this to like be watched for people just trying to like have a bad time, good time either, because it's not very entertaining. It's just bizarre. The best you can do is get like a wry smile of what the hell are they doing. That's like the best you're gonna get out of this. With all of that said, there are a few good things underlying all of this. One of them that I think it captures really well in a way that I think very few movies actually, other movies actually capture, is that this movie does sort of take a really good sense of what it's like, what your memory might be like of being a kid and just imagining stuff. When your imagination... Do you remember when your imagination was really good? I know this won't be universal for everybody, but maybe I'm saying too much about myself, but do you remember when you were like a really little kid, like an elementary school kid or younger, and your imagination was really strong and it would just wander and it would just come up with all these scenarios, and you didn't have to think about the exact kind of things that I talk about in this series. You didn't have to think about plot. You didn't have to think about, motivations or anything else. You were just thinking like weird, cool, whatever shit. None of that mattered. You were just making stuff up, and as soon as it came out of your mouth or like went through your brain, it was gone, and it didn't matter. You were just having a fun time imagining shit by yourself or with a friend or something. And none of that kind of stuff really mattered. That is the one thing that I think this movie has going on for it in a pretty strong way. And like getting that sense of what it's like to be just have a kid's imagination. Does it make for a particularly good movie? No, it doesn't. Because the reason that when you're an adult and some kid starts rambling a 10-minute run-on sentence about this imaginary world that you just sort of turn your brain off is because it's entertaining. It's only entertaining to the person who's making it up. It's not entertaining to anybody else, unless they're like actively engaged in it. And it really only works for kids of a certain age. And so maybe, undeniably, part of this is just I'm an adult coming to a very, very kid story. Okay, I'll put a pin in that for a second. The one other thing I want to point out that I think it does okay, or at least starts to try and touch on, and then doesn't do a whole lot with, unfortunately, is the way in which real world issues that a kid might run into feed back into their mind and into the way that they play and the way that they imagine things. And this movie sort of brushes over a whole bunch of honestly really serious topics that it doesn't really address. And frankly, I think I'd be a little more alarmed if it actually did try and address them. But it kind of indirectly talks about a whole bunch of things that the main character is like working through and how it affects his experience and the things that he thinks about. He's dealing with bullies and a teacher who doesn't seem to care about doing teaching or respecting the kids or treating them with, care or anything. He's got parents who are like questionably not good parents and also have problems of their own, including employment and possible imminent divorce. And it like only kind of glazes over these in a surprisingly nuanced way in terms of, the fact that this is being glazed over in a like adult narrative kind of way is very inappropriate. But for a kid, that's like how a kid perceives their world a lot of the time. It's, I heard something in passing, I didn't fully understand it, and like I'm just sort of like, going through life. So if nobody like sits me down and tries to talk to me about this, or if nobody tries to help me with this scenario that I'm dealing with and I don't know how to ask about how to get help with it, that's just sort of the experience of being a kid of a certain age, of that sort of like, tween, I hate that term, that sort of age. So like it starts to touch on those things, and I think it does a surprisingly good job of them. It doesn't really address them in super meaningful ways for the most part, but I think it like pays attention to how a kid thinks in a surprisingly appropriate way. There was the thing I'm coming back to, and I didn't note it down. This is the problem with not scripting these. It's gonna kill me. It's it's not good. The movie is not good, and I cannot by any stretch of the imagination recommend that anybody watch this. I'm really curious whether those Spy Kids movies that I was talking about, like that I have some decent memories of, hold up at all, or if they are as atrocious to my perception as these are. I think they're better. My memory is that at least they have some like thin on the ground plotting and stuff like that actually works. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe if I go back on it, I'll see. I'm really curious for the people who did see this when it was in theaters, or have those really fond memories of it, or who have those memorable references, whether that's a matter of the same sort of like childhood nostalgia and memory of it being really good, or like how much that influences the experience of having, if you come back to rewatch it now. How strong is that nostalgia? I don't think any adult can genuinely come back and say this is a decent film in any way. But it's always a question, I tend to, when people have nostalgia for things, I often at least am able to understand why they might, even if I like strongly disagree. This one I don't get. Everything about it is just so bad. The only redeeming quality might be just the bizarre acting of George Lopez in this like weird character that he ends up playing for the majority of the film. It's just so that might actually stick with me. That might haunt my dreams. This movie is so weird. I honestly kind of don't know why I watched it or why I kept watching it. This is the exact kind of thing that if I wasn't sort of intentionally watching it for something like this, I would absolutely have like turned this off after 10 minutes. Especially because it like ramps up in a weird way. Yeah. I don't know. If I remember the other thought I had, I'll throw in the comments, or maybe I already touched on it and didn't realize it. Yeah, this one's just weird. If you happened to see this when you were a kid, and I know it was like, it did okay. It didn't do well at the box office, but it was fine. And I know a lot of people watched it. If you do have memories of this, I'm so curious. So let me know in the comments. This was a bizarre tangent to take in this series, but I'm kind of glad I did in a weird way. It's a weird kind of perspective to record. Anyway. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.